Man of Medan's story begins 70-some years before the main events of the game. During World War II, the Japanese forces occupying China set up a chemical weapons facility in a water treatment plant deep in Manchuria. Near the end of the war, a team of soldiers was sent to investigate it, and were killed in the attempt. At some later point, the US government captured the facility and discovered what they had been working on. A hallucinogenic compound that triggered people's fear responses so intensely that it could drive them to turn violently against one another, commit suicide, or even die from a terror-induced heart attack. Because of the place it was discovered and the look of its crystals when in raw form, the US government gave this chemical weapon the unimaginative name Manchurian Gold. Along with the bodies of the soldiers who were killed looking for it, the army loads the chemicals into the Orang Medan, the transport from which the game gets its name. Orang is an Indonesian word meaning man, hence Man of Medan. Over the next 2 weeks of the journey, strange things are reported on the ship. Crewmen see ghosts and hear voices. Since almost none of the crew knows about the chemical weapon that is being released by the damp sea air, their focus is on the coffins that were brought aboard, and suspicions develop that the voyage has been cursed. This all comes to a head just a few hours away from Tahiti, when an electrical storm ignites the water-soaked chemicals in the hold, letting out a potent hallucinogenic fog. This drives one of the hold guards insane, and he commits suicide by leaping from the ship. The captain orders the ship to stop and drops anchor so that they can search for the man overboard. And it's during this bout of frantic activity that the fog spreads throughout the ship's ventilation system, driving everyone on board to madness. All around the ship, people start killing each other, killing themselves, or simply dying from sheer fright. During the night of terror, the ship radios for assistance, announcing the crew's plan to abandon ship. A rescue plane is sent out, loaded with lifeboats and supplies. When it arrives, a crew member, believing the Orang Medan to be under attack, fires at the plane with anti-aircraft guns, critically damaging it and killing some of the crew. The plane turns towards the nearest island, but doesn't make it, ditching in the ocean 20 miles north of the coast. Because the radio was damaged in the attack, the plane wasn't able to broadcast the Medan's location, nor explain about the attack, so the US government assumed that the Medan had sunk, and the rescue plane had crashed during the search. Further search efforts were called off, and the Orang Medan went undiscovered for the next 72 years. In 2019, a group of 5 20-somethings, the couple, Julia and Alex, their respective siblings Conrad and Brad, and boat captain Fliss, go on a diving trip to document the wreck of the plane, which Brad has somehow located. While on the trip, they're harassed by some fishermen, whose motives are initially unclear. They introduce themselves by ramming the Duke of Milan, Fliss's boat, at high speed, although it's never clear exactly why. Were they initially planning to extort money from the people on the ship after purposefully damaging their own boat, and things only escalate after Conrad is cruelly dismissive of them? Or was it always their plan to kidnap the crew, and the initial contact was just a way to see if the ship looked like a soft enough target? In any event, the kidnappers discover the reference to Manchurian gold on a flight plan recovered from the wreck, and decide to go looking for the ship that was carrying it, hoping to come across a windfall. This leads to the main action of the game, in which all of the characters are haunted by strange visions on the ship, and they have to fight both against the effects of the fog, and the murderous criminals trapped on the ship along with them. The game's big twist is that there's nothing supernatural happening on the ship, and that the characters are just suffering from the effects of the Manchurian gold, which has become far less potent after 70 years of exposure to ocean air. To the game's credit, though, it sets up the reveal right at the start of the game, and even if the players never manage to read any of the secret files stashed around the ship, there's a good chance they could figure it out for themselves. Right in the prologue, we can see something strange about the hallucinations that the characters suffer. Not only does each character see something different, but their visions are obviously influenced by their own fears and backstories. Joe, who is desperate to see his son back in America, is haunted by visions of a spectral child. Charlie, on the other hand, is confronted by this demonic figure, one that seems oddly random until one notices that it's a living version of the martial arts dummy that he had sparred with earlier that night. The game's main characters all have similarly personal visions, with one exception. Brad, who is fascinated by the history of those who died in World War II, finds himself attacked by military zombies. Likewise, his fear of losing touch with his protective older brother manifests in visions of Alex's death. Conrad understands on some level that his womanizing originates from a fear of women, so he's haunted by a creature that switches back and forth from erotic to menacing. Julia's fears all stem from ambivalence about her relationship with Alex. She loves him, but she's also unsure about committing to him, and is just a little bit afraid of him. This creates a situation where she sees different versions of Alex everywhere, as attacker, victim, threat, and savior. Fliss, who is relatively open about her belief in the supernatural, creates an elaborate fantasy involving a satanic ritual that was being performed on the boat. She winds up creating an incredibly accurate subconscious reading of the situation, since her mind transforms the pile of chemicals into a blood-filled coffin, the electrical wiring that's spreading the fumes into a fountain of blood, and the manual for handling dangerous chemicals into a description of the sacrificial rite that she would be the victim of. Only Alex proves to have no internal life whatsoever, leading him to have hallucinations that relate only to the current threat they're experiencing, either seeing monstrous versions of the actual people who are attacking them, or in one game branch, a horrible two-headed beast that he saw in one of the coffins. So that's the full story of what's going on in the Dark Pictures' Man of Medan, which means it's time for me to talk about the many, many mistakes and plot holes that occur in this otherwise wonderful horror adventures story. In the game's prologue, we're shown the Medan leaving port in China, and then the ship massacre happens that same night. This conflicts with everything we learn on the ship, which suggests that there was more than a week at sea while increasingly intense ghost hallucinations messed with the crew, before the electrical storm and leak that caused the night of terror that destroyed the ship. It's possible that the game is simply misleading us, however, and that the opening sequence, in which the cargo is loaded onto the ship and the two sailors go wandering around a Chinese market, is actually set a few weeks before the next scene, in which they're drunkenly stumbling around deck and wind up being sent to the brig and infirmary. This conflicts with the reports we get about their crimes, though, which specifically references them getting drunk on shore leave. The Unlockable Backstory comic book actually puts this mistake into sharp relief, since it explicitly states that the altercation that ends with Joe and Charlie being sent to the brig and infirmary happens the night the cargo is loaded, and that the electrical storm is almost 2 weeks later, creating the impression that both men have been in drunken comas for over 10 days. Here's the situation. The US Army needs to secretly move 500 pounds of chemical weapons from China to the US without attracting any attention. These chemicals are very unstable, and diluted in water they release an extremely powerful hallucinogen that has been proved to have deadly effects. How would you transport that? If you said, seal it into air and watertight drums, load it onto a transport plane, and fly it there over the course of about a day, congratulations, you're smarter than everyone in the US military, according to Man of Medan. Here's what they chose to do with it. Shovel it into burlap sacks, shove the sacks into wooden crates, load the crates into the hold of a rickety transport freighter, then spend a month slowly moving it across the ocean, hoping that somehow no water gets anywhere near the incredibly dangerous chemicals that have been left sitting on an uncovered pallet in a leaky hold. Seriously, they don't even bother putting a tarp on it. Is it any wonder everyone got killed? We're told that Brad searched records of planes that disappeared without arriving at their destinations, then made an estimate about where they might have crashed. The game acts like this is somehow a clever idea, but searching the route on which a plane was supposed to be traveling is the most basic way of finding a wreck. More importantly, though, this method wouldn't have worked at all for finding this plane. Over the course of the game, we learn that the plane was dispatched to bring lifeboats and supplies to help the crew of the Orang Medan abandoned ship. They didn't have a good idea about where the Orang Medan was, though, and had to perform a grid search to look for it. Eventually, they came across it, took anti-aircraft fire, and then attempted to flee back to base, only to ditch in the ocean after 50 miles or so. Add to that the fact that the Army knew that it was sending the plane to rescue people ferrying top-secret chemical weapons, and you've got a situation where there would be no public record of the plane taking off, where it was searching, or when it lost radio contact with base. There's absolutely no way that Brad could have found out where this plane was. There's an easy fix for this, of course. Brad and Alex could have had a family member who was on the plane or involved in dispatching it, and they're investigating an old story about a lost plane. But the story as presented in the game is complete nonsense. Conrad can get Julia killed by causing a small explosion while lighting the grill, convincing her to surface early so that she gets the bends. While this makes Conrad look like an idiot, the real question is this. Why does Fliss have a bottle of lighter fluid next to a gas grill? Yes, Conrad should know not to use it, but seriously, why is it there in the first place? This file appears in the game, offering some backstory about the US government's interest in Manchurian gold. It details an agreement to resettle a scientist in America and shield him from war crimes prosecution in exchange for his willingness to work on a chemical weapons program. This is all completely realistic, look up Operation Paperclip if you'd like more information on the subject, but it's not diplomatic immunity. Diplomatic immunity is the agreement that diplomatic officers can't be charged with crimes in the countries they're dispatched to, and exists to prevent political prosecutions and legal hostage-taking. It has nothing to do with this situation, since the Japanese scientist is obviously not a diplomatic agent, nor is he going to become one for America. This non-prosecution and asylum agreement is something completely different, and the game's writers were obviously just confused about terminology. If the characters call the army and find no other way off the boat, one of two endings occurs. Either they're locked up because the US government finds out they know the secret of the Orang Medan, or they're executed because the US government knows that it's the Orang Medan that they're stranded on. It's a pretty standard bleak horror ending, but there's a problem with it. There's no reason for it to happen. The game seems to think that the Orang Medan's cargo of Manchurian gold is something that's worth killing people to cover up. That's obviously not the case. There was nothing illegal about anything the US government was doing on that boat. The US government had an active chemical weapons development program at the time. Yes, it's tragic that a chemical leaked and killed something like 100 people, but it was an accident, not a crime that needs to be covered up. When US-made mustard gas killed people after a store of it was blown up in World War II, it was a secret at the time, but now it's just part of the history of that conflict. The loss of the Orang Medan happened 72 years before the game's main plot begins. Everyone involved in the Manchurian Gold Project is dead or long retired. Simply put, it's not a secret worth keeping at all, let alone at the cost of human lives. If the characters lose the distributor cap and don't call for help, they can wind up stranded on the Medan, having to decide between starving on the Medan or trying to paddle the Duke of Milan into a shipping lane to find help. How have all of these characters forgotten about the Duke's radio? You don't need the boat's engine to run the radio. It's battery operated, and that battery would have a hand crank for manual charging. They can just call for the Coast Guard to rescue them. We see the radio's antenna array destroyed when the Duke bumps into the Medan, but that's not a real problem. They can simply take their battery and radio, strip down the wire that used to connect it to the antenna, and then connect that to the Medan's antenna array. I can only see them going to all of this trouble if they can't just leave, but it's definitely something they could have done. If Fliss is with the group when they reach the radio room, the scene that follows makes no sense whatsoever. While the other characters might just spin a dial randomly hoping to find someone to rescue them and immediately chat with the army, Fliss would obviously know the Coast Guard's frequency by heart and immediately dial right into it. If she's with the group, they should have been rescued almost immediately since they're no more than 4 hours from shore, probably far less given the speeds the Coast Guard is capable of. This isn't true for all playthroughs, but when Fliss and Brad meet in Cargo Hold 2, a combination of decisions will result in an outcome, where she's just discovered that the hallucinations are likely caused by gas from a pile of chemicals in the next room, and that you can get rid of the effects by exposure to fresh air. At the same time, Brad will show up wearing a gas mask, suffering from no hallucinations whatsoever. If anything else happens, I can understand why Brad might toss the gas mask away at the end of the scene. But if Fliss knows about the gas, and Brad has a gas mask, why on earth would she not mention how vitally important it is that they hang on to it? I know we have to suspend our disbelief somewhat in a game like this, but the functional electrical system on the Orang Medan beggars belief. There's a line in the game where it's pointed out that the radio should still work, since the fundamental technology hasn't changed much in 70 years. But neither has the ability of salt air to corrode metal, or for fuel to break down into non-usable sludge. If the Orang Medan actually was a ghost ship and something supernatural was going on, this would be forgivable. But since that's not the case, it just defies all logic. To close out, I thought it would be nice to recognize how the game makes a couple of references to Until Dawn, Supermassive's previous entry in the interactive horror genre. First, there's the appearance and body language of the monster that Conrad believes is chasing him. This is clearly based on the Wendigos from Until Dawn. It may even reuse some of the actual animation. Then there's this moment, which is a visual reference to the original cover art of Until Dawn, from back when it was a PS3 move-focused game about shining a flashlight around in first person. Before we go, I thought it might be a good idea to offer some wild speculation about the next game in the series, which might be called A Little Hope, if this video premonition is to be believed. So, what do we have to go on? A set of woman's feet standing on a railing, a man on the lawn below yelling at her to stop, and the sudden jerk of a noose halting someone's drop. Is this a suicide? A murder? It's probably the inciting incident that kicks off the game's story. But what theme will that story have? Will it finally feature the slasher mystery that I've been hoping they'd get back to since the original Until Dawn was abandoned? Or might it have a religious theme? All of the premonition paintings in Man of Medan are boat-themed due to the setting, other than the one for Little Hope, which seems to depict the beasts of Revelation rising from the sea. Will the game be religion-themed horror, or am I reading too much into the choice of painting? Either way, I'm incredibly excited to discover what comes next, and can't wait for the next chapter of the Dark Pictures to arrive. I've been the Hidden Object Guru. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed Man of Medan as much as I did, and I'll see you back here for the next thing. But until then, au revoir.